Recording this session.
Okay. Go
Awesome.
ahead. Thank you, Sandhya. And thank you, Diana, for that awesome introduction. And I hope you all enjoyed my expert harmonica playing. I am learning the harmonica. I just want to put that out there. And it's harder than you might think, actually. Anyway, so as Diana said, I have the pleasure of running the Bike Coalition here in Silicon Valley. Been doing that for 7 years, but prior to that, I worked for 14 years in the affordable housing and housing advocacy arena. And so I am super excited to be here with you all tonight talking about the intersection of housing and transportation and land use and transportation, and why we as bike people who love and are passionate about bikes, should also care about housing and how that relates to our success in advocating for bike lanes. So I'm going to go ahead and jump right in. And let's see, go to the next slide, Sandhya. So just a little bit of framing before we have each of the panelists introduce themselves. I wanted to just point out something here, again, getting at the intersection of land use, housing, and transportation, and in particular on this slide, bikes. So we did, SVBC did some public opinion research right before COVID. It was like, literally like two weeks before everything shut down, we pulled our poll out of the field. We did it in partnership with the Mineta Transportation Institute, surveyed 1,000 folks in Santa Clara County. And we were trying to better understand why people make the decisions that they make when it comes to transportation. So we surveyed a bunch of things, and all that data is up on our website. It's super fascinating to geek out on. But what I want to point out here is we asked folks, how often do you ride to a destination, and how often do you ride for recreation or exercise? And you can see those two columns there. And I want you to focus on the destination one. And I want you to look all the way down at the bottom when it gets into geography. Because when you look and you scan and you say, what's the highest number here? It's 12.1 for central San Jose, meaning downtown San Jose, where it's more urban. It's a downtown. And you ask yourself, where is the number lowest? It's in South County, like Gilroy area. And so the point is land use matters, housing matters. Essentially, the further you have things from each other, destinations, jobs, housing, we are not going to be able to, no matter what the quality of our bike infrastructure looks like, if things are far away from each other, we're not going to be able to get folks on bikes. So that's basically what we're here to talk about, the relationship of housing and slash land use to transportation and biking. So that is all I need for that slide. And I'm going to go ahead and kick it over to the panelists and ask them to just introduce themselves real quick and tell us, where do they hail from, what makes them an expert on this topic, and why we would have invited them here tonight. So starting with Warren Logan, and we'll just go Warren, Matthew, Gloria, and then Dan.
Yeah, good evening, everybody. It's 80 degrees in Oakland. That's where I'm hailing from right now. So forgive me if I just start like melting away. I would consider myself an expert in the space in part because I ride a bike. That's that one right there. Professionally, though, I've worked in a number of different seats around the topic of transportation, not just bicycle infrastructure. I've worked in a design firm in urban design. I have also managed a parking program, which also impacts the rights of way that people bicycle on and even walk on. And then more recently, I was the policy director for transportation in the city of Oakland for the mayor's office. And now I'm at Lighthouse Public Affairs as a government relations expert, working with a lot of developers, both in affordable housing and market rate housing. And oftentimes we are looking to find intersections of different people who care about lots of different things that are going to position us to support our housing projects. And I am excited to be here with you all tonight and and sort of help galvanize all of you to care about affordable housing. And I'll pass it to Gloria.
Gloria? Is Gloria
Yeah.
with us?
I'm here. Can folks not see me and hear me?
Go
Now
ahead.
we can.
Yep, we can hear you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, no, I'm here. Sorry, I thought somebody else was next, but I'm here now. Hi, everyone. Gloria Bruce, Executive Director of East Bay Housing Organizations. Pronouns are she, her. If you occasionally see me go off video, it's because I'm solo parenting tonight, and one of my kids is running around behind me, so my apologies. So I have led East Bay Housing Organizations, which is based in Oakland, but work across the Alameda and Contra Costa counties. I've been the executive director for 7 years and been with the organization for more than 11. So basically what we do is we work to create, protect, and preserve affordable housing opportunities. We work with a lot of member organizations and individuals to do that. We work with directly impacted folks. We work with nonprofit developers. We're working on laws and money, but we're also working on hearts and minds. So I know a lot about affordable housing, but I also, I sometimes describe myself as a recovering urbanist. I love cities, but it's a complicated love. I used to be on the board of Walk Oakland, Bike Oakland. So I do cycle, I do walk, I do take transit. And so I've seen sort of both sides of this. So I'm happy to be here tonight with you all.
Awesome. How about Matt?
Hi, everyone. My name is Matthew Lewis. My pronouns are he and him. I am Director of Communications for California YIMBY. We're a statewide policy advocacy organization trying to end the housing shortage and affordability crisis for not just all Californians, but all the people who would like to move to California. And shout out to a lot of states that are really struggling right now with some tricky politics around some very hot button issues. Trying to make California more welcoming and open to everyone. My interest in housing and biking, there are actually 8 bicycles in the garage, 1 for guests, and then another 7 because, you know, I apologize, that's a low number. I am an N+1 person when it comes to bikes, so working on it still. But also I'm very active in local housing advocacy in Berkeley and in the East Bay. And I'm really excited about this conversation because I can't in my mind separate the issues of how people move around in their community and where they live and how they afford to live there. So really excited for that.
Awesome. Thank you. And Matthew set the bar in terms of the number of bikes. And unfortunately, we're going to pass it off to Dan, who I think only has 1 bike, but he's an academic, so he's really, really smart.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for inviting me. My name is Dan Chapman. I am the co-chair of the Department of City and Regional Planning at UC Berkeley and an associate professor there. And I've been doing research on land use and transportation relationships for about 20 years. And I'm really interested in this topic and would echo some of the comments that my fellow panelists have just made about some of the importance of these relationships. I do own 1 bicycle. I've had it since 2006. So I covet other bicycles, but I don't have any others. And I do use it quite a bit. I'm a bicycle commuter. So nice to join you all.
Great, thanks. So that was a real brief summary of all these great folks. I figured we would start with just some level setting for everybody, because not everybody, when we throw around these terms, housing and affordable housing, people may not know what we're talking about, especially in Silicon Valley. Not that it's that different up in Oakland and other parts of the Bay, but housing is really unaffordable. So, and I failed to mention that although May is Bike Month and we have Bike to Wherever days, formerly Bike to Work Day, May is also Affordable Housing Month, at least in Santa Clara County. Is it Bay Area wide? Yep. Awesome. I will just say that the bike people had May 1st. So like we're letting the housing people share May with us. I'm joking. But wanted to start with just reminding folks that it's Bike Month and it's also Affordable Housing Month. And that's the main reason we're having this conversation today, because the two go hand in hand. So to start with, I would say, who would like to just kind of help us understand when we say affordable housing, what are we talking about?
I'm going to encourage Gloria to go first as the
Good idea.
resident expert, and then we will follow her.
Oh, sure. Thank you. Thank you, Warren. And yeah, it is Affordable Housing Month regionally. It started as Affordable Housing Week, actually in 1999, Shiloh. So I don't know when Bike Month started as May, but we may have a competition. So we're just gonna throw some out there to see. But I'm really happy to be here and bring both of these things together. So when we talk about affordable housing, there's probably a couple of things that are going to come to mind. Like, is it just housing that I can afford? Like, literally, I can afford my rent or my mortgage and still put food on the table, or pay for childcare or do whatever I need to do. That's how most people think of it. There's also what we've described as capital A, capital H affordable housing, and that usually means something that is officially subsidized in some way, usually with a combination of government and private funding or with a voucher. There's a lot of different kinds. We won't get into that tonight, but I think a lot of what I'll be talking about is the latter category. But the overall message I think all of us are trying to convey is that, like, we just need way more affordable housing that people can afford, whether it's official or it's unofficial, and that there is actually a role for, first of all, there isn't a division between people who are really into bikes and people who need housing. It's all tied together, and that there are ways that the bicycle advocacy community can actually really help to promote affordable housing for all of us. And I'll just say that a very standard definition, whether you're talking about subsidized housing or not, is that housing is considered affordable if you are spending no more than 30% of your monthly income on your housing costs. And I just saw Diana's face. I think a lot of people in the Bay Area are like, what?
It's still a lot of money.
30%? Yeah. For some people, yeah, I mean, we have really high median incomes. For some people, that's no problem. For a lot of people, what? Of course I pay more than 30%. Another number that's relevant is if you are paying more than 50%, then you're considered extremely rent burdened and at risk of homelessness. So that's when it really starts to be an issue. And there are a lot of people in the Bay Area who are at that level as well. So I'll leave it there for the moment.
Gloria, I'd like to just add to your point that's sort of the like income strata that I think that the capital A, capital H affordable housing that a lot of people focus on. And one of the other trends that I'm sure a lot of folks on this call might be familiar with is the sort of like groups of people that we're trying to house. And I just want to give a couple of examples. And I provide this caveat that I think that this is a trap that we're falling into. So that's my personal opinion, that you often see, teacher affordable housing or police and fire affordable housing or senior affordable housing. And one of the things I think is really important for all of us to kind of recognize is that while I think we get into this sort of idea about who should be eligible for affordable housing and at what levels and so on, that is probably not the best place to start a conversation. And so I want to provide that same caveat in the same way that oftentimes as we talk about people who can bicycle or people who we expect are bicycling to wherever place, that we are often thinking of a certain group of people when that is not actually representative of the folks who are really biking in the streets, whether to work or for fun or with their kids and so on. And so that same intersection of like who we're talking about applies both to affordable housing and for bicycling as well.
Anyone else want to chime in on this question?
I might just make one quick comment, which, Matt was just about to say something. Well, I'll say it very quickly, which is that most affordable housing is not provided as designated formal affordable housing. And so that's a good thing to keep in mind, is most of it is actually market provided, and it tends to be older housing.
What we call naturally occurring.
Yeah, there's a big conversation in the housing world right now around something that people refer to as missing middle housing. And it's I wouldn't go around saying I'm all for missing middle, because it gets too much in the weeds really quickly. But in the old days, and what I mean by that is like up until the 60s and 70s and some places in the 80s, cities all over California and really all over the country, they just allowed more housing to be built continuously. You were allowed to do more infill. You could do 4plexes, 6plexes, 6 flats, 4-story apartment buildings. And if you look around, they're all over. They're all over the East Bay. You can find them in certain parts of South Bay. They're certainly all over Los Angeles. And what happened is we made it largely illegal to build those anymore. And so that's really, to Dan's point, that most of the affordable housing people live in is that older housing stock that has depreciated. And what used to happen was older buildings would depreciate and then they'd get cheaper, but you were building enough new homes so that wealthier people who wanted to live in something newer and more modern could move into that. But now what you have is, you're very familiar in South Bay, is you have these old tumble down shacks that people are buying for $1 million. And there's a direct connection between those two things. So if we had been building continuously and allowing more homes to be built in our cities, those shacks going for $1 million would actually be affordable starter homes for middle income families, because they used to be. So there's a little bit of a back to the future component of housing, which is like really trying to look back and say, what were we doing better before that we messed up? And what do we need to do to fix it going forward? So.
Matthew, I'm glad that you brought up, I love the word shack. I'm going to use that as many times as I can during this panel now. That one of the other factors that's a part of the conversation now around affordable housing, and Dan, this is like a thing for you as well, is these sort of like neighborhoods of opportunity or like high resource neighborhoods as well. It is not enough, and you'll see us talk about this today or this evening, excuse me, it's not enough to just have an affordable house, because as we know, if you are located in the middle of nowhere, then that often then will predict the type of modality you can use to get to work, to get to your friends, to get to other homes, et cetera. And so I want to kind of layer on that it is both a price that we are talking about that is affordable for groups of people of all kinds to live comfortably. The second bit being, and I think Matthew mentioned this a bit too, is like making sure that there's a reliability or some resiliency that as the market changes, you are not going to be out on the street with a whim or a quick change in rent. And that is in fact something that both policy around rent control can support and deed restricted affordable housing. And then the last bit, as I mentioned before, is the resources around those communities, whether that's grocery stores, where we see oftentimes, I live over in West Oakland, there is not a grocery store in West Oakland, but there's a lot of naturally affordable housing that is very quickly spiking because people, including myself, have moved here with higher incomes. So again, sort of price, resiliency, and opportunity as well.
Thank you. That was a great overview, and I want to move us into talking very explicitly about the heart of the issue, which is why people who love bikes should also care about housing. And before I go there, I just want to put just a finer point on what you all said, and because when you talk about housing, I mean, at the end of the day, we need more supply. And we need more of a certain type of housing, stuff that's more dense, and in particular, because of density, it tends to be more affordable. But just to get to what you all said, you've got your single family detached home, which is an ownership product. Sometimes those are for rent. You've got your apartments, which is rental, and that's a dense product. And you've got condos, which is an ownership product, but also a dense product. And the price points for all of these are very different. If you're trying to get into the ownership market, the difference between a single family home and a condo is huge. And so these different product types meet different segments of the market. So I just wanted to highlight that piece of things. And then just get to the heart of the matter, which is we've got a bunch of people who love bicycles who are here tuned in. Why should bike folks, bring our bike bells and show up at city council meetings and ring them and say, yes, we need more housing, build it. Who wants to start with that one?
Maybe or Matthew, I see you're gearing up.
Well, so the thing I want to say to everybody who rides a bike is think about your typical ride. How far are you actually going? You're not going 15 miles every time you go out the door for a commute. I mean, some people, yes, you're commuting 15, 20, 25 miles, right? but most people who are using a bike for transportation are going relatively short distances. And that's a really critical thing to bring to your thought process around why housing is actually central to bicycle advocacy. Because the distance people have to go from where they live is largely determinative of the choice of mode they use to make that trip. What we know is that a huge number of people who drive a lot would tell you, yeah, it kind of sucks, but like I live out in the middle of nowhere and there's no grocery store and there's no bus, and man, the roads are dangerous, so I'm not going to ride my bike on that. Those are all the right answer. They're not wrong. And so I think it's really important to recognize that while, yes, there is a category of people who want to live in more isolated areas and rural areas, and they want to have bigger pieces of land, that's their right in this country. But we're grossly undersupplying housing in places where people could take more trips by bicycle. And I want to be clear, bikes are sort of like in the ecosystem, right? It's also buses, it's also other forms of transit. So it's not like everybody's going to ride the bike, but in places where you make it more convenient and safer to ride the bike, you also improve the quality of transit service. You also improve the walkability of a neighborhood. So bikes in a way are kind of like an indicator species of the fact that you're doing other things right, such as more affordable housing in a denser area, such as a grocery store you can actually walk to, that you only put if you have a dense enough land use pattern so that the grocery store can call itself a business. It needs a lot of customers. You need people there for them to be a business. So I sort of look at it as like, if you see a lot of people on bikes, what you know about that area is that they've done a lot of other things right on land use that have led to people choosing to ride a bike. And I think I'll stop there.
Yeah, I love that point, Matthew, and I agree with that. And I'm in a yes and mood right now, which is that I think that is true for a lot of communities, but I will also kind of speak for cities like Oakland, where in many respects, when you see someone riding a bicycle, it may not indicate any of those things. That, you know, I live in West Oakland. I live on a very busy street where there is no bicycle infrastructure to be seen or heard of, right? And there are people riding their bikes up and down the street because it is the only way, really direct from the BART station up to sort of Northwest Oakland. And so at the same time, I often think about the people who are biking, and this kind of goes to your question, Shiloh, is like, who are we talking about? Oftentimes the sort of Venn diagram of the people who are bicycling in some cities might in fact be the same people who truly need affordable housing, that these are the same people that we're talking about. And I think that this was perhaps, looking back on the previous panel that we had, maybe a flaw in the way that they were talking about it, that it is very common for us to use this narrative that people who are bicycling, in fact, are predominantly white and wealthy. And in fact, that is true in a number of cities, even in Oakland or even across the Bay, but that there are also groups of people, pockets of neighborhoods that are dependent on alternative modes of transport because driving is not an option for them, or driving is sometimes an option, but not always a dependable option. And so I guess the other way to look at this is that people who care about affordable housing often ride bikes, and people who often ride bikes need affordable housing as well, that they're the same group. The second way to look at this, though, and I'm going on a TED Talk for a second here, to Matthew's point, is that there are those people, though, who fit that description, the whiter and more affluent men who I think can use their power to affect some really great change in the cities that they live in, and share their voices on issues that otherwise they are not commonly focused on to better their cities. And that's sort of a world peace argument, but I do mean that quite seriously too.
Gloria or Dan?
I would have,
Gloria.
yeah, I would have to just really strongly agree with everything that Warren just said, and actually what Matthew said too, which is that, you know, people, whether you're a person who rides a bike or a person who cares about affordable housing, is often the same person. That, like, I think we all have in common that we want safe streets that aren't choked by traffic, with drivers who are angry because they've been sitting in traffic for too long, and that they are more likely to lash out or drive in not a safe fashion. We all want sidewalks that are lively and safe feeling. We all want streets that are activated. So I think also sorts of people, regardless of your normal mode of transportation, want those things, and both more affordable housing and better bike infrastructure serves those needs often together. And there's increasingly programs that actually knit those things together, which I'm sure we'll talk about. And the only other thing I want to say is I really, also, like, if you want to make sure that your local bike shop is staffed, or your coffee shop is staffed, or whatever, you actually have to have housing that people who work in a bike shop, or work as a barista, or work as a preschool teacher can actually afford to live in. And I really appreciate Warren's point about who has power in these development and city conversations. And just to note that it is incredibly important to build more housing. We do have a housing shortage for people who are missing middle, but let's be clear that housing shortage has hit different groups of people very differently over the decades. And there has always been a shortage of quality affordable housing for people who are Black, people who are Latino, people who are Asian, who are explicitly barred from certain neighborhoods, certain types of housing, people with disabilities who do not have the same choices. So let's keep that in mind, that just building the housing without in mind to that equity is not going to get us to where I think we all want to be.
Thanks, Gloria. So I'll just add a couple quick things. That one thing to point out here is that affordable housing includes housing that doesn't have parking, and that affordable housing sometimes does and sometimes doesn't have parking. But the point is that the denser you build housing, the more likely it is that that doesn't include nearly as much parking, and that goes along with encouraging the use of alternative modes, including cycling. You have lots of historical rules that have required large amounts of parking in development of housing, and the historical sort of zoning regulations and historical redlining that have made it less possible to build dense housing have resulted in much more parking and much more auto infrastructure. So part of this, so I would, to some extent, I believe in traffic, to put it in the following way, that we would be doing a better job of developing if our development patterns were more efficient in terms of being more dense and responding to price signals by building more housing where the housing is expensive. When we see that housing is expensive, it means that we want more housing there. The market wants more housing there. And there's demand for that. And if we can fit in more housing, it's going to mean developing less parking and having skinnier roads and all those other sorts of things that we don't do nearly as much of as we should. And those all go along with all kinds of alternative modes, including cycling. And the final thing I would just say is that the biggest predictor of whether someone cycles or not, if in a regression model trying to predict mode, is going to be distance. It's not these other things. And if you look at the demographics, in fact, of cyclists, they are actually a bit more variable than, as Warren was pointing out, than the stereotype.
Thanks, Dan.
Can I just ask, the parking mandate thing, I have an illustration for people to sort of get into their head about how bad this is. So California cities all over have these parking mandates. To show how bad that gets, the city of Los Angeles has 200 square miles of parking in Los Angeles, okay? Los Angeles County, sorry, not city, Los Angeles County, 200 square miles of parking. There are 60,000 people without homes in Los Angeles. You could house every one of them at the same density Los Angeles currently has on the parking that Los Angeles has mandated, and you would have 192 miles of parking left over. So it's not just that the parking is a waste of land on the merits. It's not just that it actually increases the cost of housing. It's that we actually force it to be built with mandates. And it results in these vast concrete landscapes. And you look at them and you're like, people could actually live there. And this is something we're doing in the Bay Area and lots of cities, is we're converting parking lots to housing. And it's a huge part of the solution.
Yeah, not to mention the cost, right? You're building all of this housing at, what, 50,000 underground, underground, you're talking 50K per stall. I don't know what it is.
Even above ground, it's that now too.
Really?
Like it's, yeah, but a combination of materials, because, inflation and labor costs are just really, really high right now. That it used to be, and sorry to just correct you, that underground parking was the most expensive. At this point, at grade, above grade, like it's just stupid expensive. And when you look at the numbers, it's like,
right.
how could we use that money better?
In the dense places. So the point here is that the parking is most expensive just where you want density. It's not as expensive on the outskirts. It's not nearly that expensive. It's another reason why it makes more sense to develop on the outskirts of metropolitan areas, because the parking is not very expensive at all to provide in that context. So that's why the parking requirement is a huge kind of poison pill to density.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for raising the parking issue, Dan. I was going to jump to the question about kind of digging a little more into land use and things that different cities are doing, like the city of San Jose structuring their general plan around a whole urban village concept, to dive a little more into that. But before we go there, since we were just talking about building housing, I want to ask a question that I didn't send to you all beforehand, which is, and Matthew, well, all of you have been through this rigmarole, but you're representing Cal YIMBY, which stands for Yes in My Backyard. Why is it so difficult to build housing? What is one of the biggest, like, why can't housing is not affordable for a variety of reasons, one of which being parking, but one of them being just the sheer amount of time it takes because people, right? People get in the way. So talk about that.
Matthew's gonna go for like 5 hours. Like,
no, I'll be brief. I want to bring back something that Gloria pointed out, because everything is a continuum, right? So we're in this point in time, but there's a whole history that got us here. And it's really hard to wrap your head around how much racism played a role in setting us up for the housing shortage. It was central. It really was. The effort to change the zoning in our cities and to restrict where people could live was driven by racism. And it wasn't that long ago. And I think people need to remember, this is recent history here. We're talking about the 1970s and early 1980s, times when a lot of us were alive and actually remember. And so because land use is this long time period sort of thing, you build a building, it's going to be there in 50 or 100 years. To look at the dramatic changes in land use that cities undertook in the 60s, 70s, and 80s to restrict housing growth, specifically out of concern for diversifying neighborhoods, let's be really clear, we haven't corrected that yet. And it's gotten so bad that we actually are increasing the need for more subsidies. So it gets concerning, because if you keep needing more and more and more subsidies, you reach this point where, like, well, where does the money actually come from? But I want to be really clear that the grounding of this was in the deliberate efforts to restrict who could live in our cities. And the people who are blocking it now, and we talk about NIMBYs and people who go to city council meetings, we've all seen them, they fight the housing all over. They are a problem. I don't want to undersell the fact that they are slowing down the process. And there's laws that have been put in place that have made it also difficult. But the history here is of deliberate exclusion. And we're trying to correct that at scale.
Who else wants to chime in on this?
I would just add to Matthew's point, and it's rare that I completely pivot from race. So follow me here for a second. That another completely different factor about why housing is both wildly unaffordable and is difficult to build is that we are still not seeing a wide array of innovation in the building sector. And what I mean by that is that in the Bay Area, we are talking right now about self-driving cars and scooters and electric bikes and all of these different new forms of mobility. But the way in which that we physically build a house or a skyscraper or you name it still depends on a relatively, I don't know if I can say the word archaic, right? But old form of technology, tried and true materials, and those materials are becoming harder and harder to source as well, right? A big portion of the Bay Area's concrete is in the Silicon Valley, and we're running out of it. And so I just want to insert here the discussion around a couple of companies like Factory OS and RAD who are building sort of prefab units that are still actually union made, but in a shop that you then ship over and stack like Legos. And that is another form of bringing the cost of housing down, because literally the way in which we are building those units is different. And so for many of you who are thinking, how can I help you? You might also work with some really interesting technology companies that might be interested in innovating in this space that I think has kind of been stuck for a very long time around, traditional materials and the way that we kind of think about labor in its construction practices. That is another field that is very much kind of untouched in my mind.
Dan, do you want to chime in here? I want to add another layer to this too, and I see that Gloria is tending to some childcare, which is showing us all how moms can do everything.
And specifically Gloria, like Gloria's casually a badass, and I just want to make sure people on the call understand that.
Thank you.
Anyway, back to Dan.
But so let me just layer in that we just went through, well, we're still going through this whole notion of opportunity housing. And what I was hoping would happen, I think a lot of people were hoping would happen, recognizing that opportunity housing is not going to solve all of our problems, right? It's like at scale, blah, blah, blah. It's kind of like equivalent to ADUs, right? You're going to onesies and twosies, but it's not going to solve our problem, but it's something, right? So like, let's do it. But I was hoping it would also spur this conversation around, like, let's talk about single family zoning and why we actually need it. What is the value? What is the true, like, what is the usefulness of single family homes? So I want to layer that in to this conversation, because I think many of the people around here, I mean, it's hot down here too. People are opportunity housing. Oh my gosh, the sky is going to fall if you put another unit on the lot next to me. So if you could talk about like that piece of it too.
I think that's where Gloria should step in right now. It looks like she might be able to.
I'm sorry, I just had to put a bow tie on a small child, start heading to his school event soon, but his other mom is here now, so I should be able to focus for the last 15 minutes. It's interesting, Shadow, that we say, what is the value of the single family home? I haven't really thought of it that way, although I think a lot of people do. I guess what I would just say is, like, I live in a single family home. I feel very fortunate to be able to do so. I live in a strange freak of zoning that probably shouldn't exist, which is I live in a single family home with a yard, with a driveway, a quarter mile from a major BART station. That actually probably is a land use that shouldn't exist, but we build at such low density that I got super lucky, and that's where I live. Most people are not that fortunate. But I guess what I would say is, like, I'm on this lonely quest to please rebrand single family zoning as, and what we're trying to dismantle as single family only zoning. I think it's really important that we let people know nobody is coming for your house. Nobody is coming to, like, personally demolish your house or to build something on top of your house. Like, that is just not what's happening. What we're saying is our neighborhoods should allow for diversity of housing types that can grow and evolve with who lives in that neighborhood and with the households in that neighborhood. So if you have a single family home, great. Maybe you expand that for another part of your family. Maybe someday you move on and someone builds a duplex, or maybe someone builds a duplex next to you, you build a cottage. It's about flexibility and choice. And I think most Americans really resonate with this idea of, like, I should have the choice, I should have the right to live in this kind of that housing. Yes, you should, and everybody should. That's why we need to make this more flexible. So I don't know if that's all what you're getting at, but that's what I have to say.
Gloria, can I add to your point too, though? And this is maybe a bit of a diatribe against a single family home. So I too live in a single family home, and I'm like, and I think I know, because I've seen the Oakland zoning code, that we're like an anomaly that just kind of is a zoning error. Like, I know it's an error because you can see that, like, the parcels should be orange instead of yellow. Like, next door to me is a very large artist loft, and, like, next door to my other neighbor is another very large condo building, and there's these two cute little Victorian homes that do not belong here. My point here, though, is that I think that there's this idea that the paragon of living styles is a single family home. And for someone who has lived for the better part of my adult life in apartments or condos, I actually would prefer to not live in a single family home. This is just where we landed. I think that in a lot of cases, suburbia can be very lonely and inflexible. And frankly, as a Black gay man, a little bit uncomfortable at a minimum. And so I think that the other part that is a bit of branding, and now the public affairs side of me is coming out a bit, is that the idea around apartments and condos and high rises have gained, and I think really touching on Matthew's point too, a very racist and classist standing, and that's a problem, right? Like that there are plenty of people who would honestly prefer to live in a multi-unit setting, because either take my grandparents, they live in the same condo building as my dad, because that's way safer for them in case they need someone to just run up and help them, right? You can't do that in a single family neighborhood, it seems, right? Or people who are kind of my age, I'm in my early 30s, and I would prefer to live much closer to my friends that are a network of social support. That's a lot easier in a denser setting. Now I have to travel longer distances just to see them. And so that's the other component, I think, to answer your question, Shiloh, about like how people view the value of a single family home.
The sort of running joke in urbanists and housing circles is how many people who show up at meetings in places like California to say, oh, don't touch my single family neighborhood. It's like the only thing that matters to me. Where do these people go for vacation? They go to Europe, they go to Florence, they go to London and Paris and Amsterdam, and they're just raving about what? Oh, there's people in the street, and it's got this community feeling, and there's restaurants you can just walk to, and I'm sort of waiting for them to have the aha moment of, we could have that too. There's no law of nature that says that you can't make a place like San Jose feel in parts of it like parts of Paris. It doesn't have to be high-rise Manhattan everywhere. In fact, frankly, because of the costs, it's very unlikely that that would happen. It's actually really expensive to build towers, like really expensive. Gloria's nodding along. I know like a lot of her partners in EBHO, they're looking at like, 7, 8, maybe up to 12
building right
stories,
behind her.
like the building behind her. That's the kind of density that we actually, I think the collective housing community is like, this is really going to be what does the bulk of the heavy lifting to solve the housing crisis. It's not going to be like Hong Kong style towers. It's just not practical. It doesn't fit, and it's really expensive. But coming back to the joke, it's sort of like you have all these people who just really, they have this like deeply, they have this deep love of these places, of these cities and other places that are not like super dense, but they're dense enough. And they can walk everywhere. And yes, they're much more bikeable. And I'm sort of saying like, that could be your neighborhood. You could also have that. And I think something that that both Warren and Gloria sort of touched on was, this notion of, there's a philosophical question here, which is, what is a city supposed to be? And it's a big question. There isn't a right answer, a wrong answer, but the answer I try to bring is a city is a dynamic place that is always changing. And the reason it's dynamic and always changing is because the people who come through a city, who either settle there or stay there for a certain amount of time and then move on, are also always changing. And this notion that we're going to fix our land use or fix the kind of buildings we live in, and try to have a dynamic city, those two things don't go together. You've got to have the city be dynamic in terms of what it looks and feels like, as well as having the people who live there and come through there being dynamic, because they're related to each other. We need to make room for people coming. We need to make it affordable for people who are going to stay here. And when you go to these great cities around the world, those are some features that they have.
Yep. Dan, I wanted to give you a chance to chime in here before we're coming up on time, and I want to explore this question a little more around like why is it so hard to build housing, and in particular, what is the value of single family zoning? Like, should we be trying so hard to preserve so much single family housing before we then close things out around a question of like, what's your advice to us at the Bike Coalition for how we get involved?
Well, I'll just say, I know we don't have very much time. So, I think we need to really, something that we don't do as planners nearly enough, in my view, is to respect the market. And what I mean by that is that the market consists of people expressing their interests and their preferences. And sometimes those interests and preferences are problematic. Sometimes they're an issue for various reasons. But often they're talking about what they prefer to live in. And the issue isn't that people shouldn't prefer to live in single family homes. They do, many of them do. The problem is that it's been systematically legislated as the only option. That's the problem with single family zoning. the notion of zoning as a whole has been that there was this kind of crude idea back many dozens of years ago that it was more beneficial to property values and things like that. And it was a way of keeping people out as well, keeping people of color out by creating single family zones that could actually have explicit covenants embedded in them as well, right? So if we were to allow single family zoning to be more flexible, what that would mean is we would get more density. We would get the market would dictate more density. It doesn't have to be something that we are dictating. We don't have to say we have to build 40-story towers near BART. We don't need to say that. What we can do is say, okay, we're not going to legislate single family zoning near BART. In fact, we're not going to legislate single family zoning anywhere. And we shouldn't, and we should allow for moderate levels of density everywhere. And if we were to do that, we'd have a lot more alternative mode use, in addition to having a lot more affordability. So, and I'm skeptical. I know I see some. There was a question that you had, Shiloh, about the sort of the 15-minute community and the 30-minute community and so on. Really skeptical about that as an actual effective way of decreasing auto use, because people don't confine themselves to different radii and different like the minutes of commuting. They just don't. What we need to encourage though is a market driven clustering that would ordinarily have happened, except for the fact that we systematically stopped it from happening over and over again in racist ways and in ways that were essentially about allowing the auto to dominate everywhere. And it's that modification that needs to happen. And if we were to do that, some people will choose to live in single family homes still, but many of them will not, and they will have that option.
Thanks. And just so we have 5 minutes, so I'd love for you all to give us advice on how does the bike community play in this space? How can we be helpful? And Dan, I was hoping you might mention, related to the comment you just made, and I don't know if this is what you were saying, but there is a percent of we know what the percent of trips are for going to work versus everything else, and it's it's very stark, right? We think that most the problematic areas are work trips, and it is because they're clustered on certain times of day, but the vast majority of our trips are for everyday errands and stuff.
Yeah, it's something like 50% of trips are for commute trips, 85% is for everything else, maybe another 10% for passenger serving trips, and another that leaves around 70 or 75% of trips that are for non-work purposes. And so commuting is not everything, obviously. And so the notion of thinking about jobs housing balance or focusing only on the commute is completely insufficient. What we need to focus on is the vast majority of trips, and those are the discretionary trips. Those are the trips that people do have some choice and latitude over in a different way than they do with their work trip.
Which speaks to the success potentially of the 15-minute city, yes?
Well, the issue with the 15-minute city is that a lot of it is, so there's we won't get into details here, but basically people like to make choices over their non-work trips. The question is, what sorts of conditions do they face? And those conditions that they face are largely conducive to driving. So regardless of whether the 15-minute city exists or not, if I can drive everywhere easily, I'll drive somewhere. It'll be a 5-minute city. It's not sufficient to have a 15-minute city without addressing the auto infrastructure issue that we were talking about previously, parking and roads.
Yep. I'm going to say, Gloria, what should the Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition do to be more helpful on housing policy?
Well, I just appreciate you having this conversation, and there's all sorts of stuff popping up in the chat that I wish we had more time to address. I'm also happy to drop my email in the chat. I would say just educate yourself. It's an incredibly complicated and nuanced issue. You don't need to know all those nuances, but you do need to know how to show up to say yes to housing, how to have a framework that takes in a broad point of view, and how to remember that what we're dealing with is actually it's an obstacle for the best possible biking, but like at the end of the day, it's actually a moral and human crisis that we're talking about here. We know this. We see people living outdoors we see people, going paycheck to paycheck, worried about getting evicted. And that's what we all need to be coming together to solve, right? And then hopefully happily biking to our jobs and recreation once we've solved those problems. So I would just say show up, educate yourself, work with SV at Home, who are leading the charge on this in your neck of the woods. And thanks for showing up today.
Awesome. Warren, you worked for a mayor's office. Yeah.
Yeah. And I have the PTSD to show it. I would actually just follow up on Gloria's point that imagine every single time that your group organizes over any type of safe streets infrastructure or bicycle infrastructure, trails, etc. Do exactly that, but for affordable housing projects. Like you actually know the tools that you need to employ, and you just need to direct them to additional areas of focus, one of those being affordable housing.
Thank you. Matt, Dan, did you want to just chime in real quick? We're at time and I need to hand it back over to Diana to wrap things up before we break into our local teams. Did you want to chime in real quick?
No, thank you.
Get involved at City Hall and join California YIMBY. We do the advocacy at the state level to try to unleash more housing at the local level. And we work very closely with, I work closely with the folks on this call, and there's a big network of us doing the work. So sign up wherever you can.
Awesome. Thank you to all of our panelists. This was really awesome. We can continue this conversation, but we're going to cut it short. Everybody drop your contact info in the chat so that our folks can pepper you with more